right? And so you know this one, right? Giami, right? And this meaning, right? And for me, that's very significant because it began to suggest something about a connection or ideation of supreme being, of the supremeness of God, right? And that to me drew me in as well, right? But there's a range of belief systems that are affiliated with this sort of central notion of a God. Giami or Nat Capone, there are a few other names that are affiliated. The supreme being connected to humans through earth, water, animals, and spiritual beings. But also connected to cosmology and belief is the clan, lineage, and family, right? They're vital elements, considered the most sacred institution, right? And what the Europeans and outside groups called fetish was actually something that was known as suman, or the obasam, or shrines, right? So they did have, belief in talismans and other devices that they could wear. They believed they could protect them when they arrived here to the Americas. That's why, and we can talk about their validity all day, right? My dad's a minister. So, we can have this conversation, right? But for me, it's what sticks out there is that, hey, wow, here are these ideas of spirit, right? And sort of what is their meaning? And it couldn't all be malevolence and darkness, right? And the main priest is known as the Akomfo, right? Some of you may have heard that name, Akomfo. We'll talk about it again relative to Akomfo Noche, right? There's also the Asofo priest. There are several names that we use to describe priests. And that priest, the main priest, this Akomfo, is called an interpreter or mouthpiece. A guardian spirit, he speaks for the guardian spirit of the nation, of a town, or of a family, right? And then you also too have a benevolent side to this belief system, the Obaifo, right? Which, if you know about the Jamaican history and culture, some is etymology affiliated to the word obey, right? Obey, right? There are very real connections linguistically to those two phrases, right? History and culture at a range points that very clearly that validates the etymological linguistic connection, right? But, you could imagine which priests would be the ones that would be the most manifest in the Americas. Think about the drama and the horror and the violence of the Middle Passage. Think about the fact that if African spirituality is perceived as negative and malevolent, and there are laws in Jamaica at length from 1680 onward point to that, right? So if those are cases, again, it puts us at a place where we can start to ask better questions, right? I think we can see where that witch, that Obaifo, that person that would be in the cave, in the darkness, practicing in secret, will really grow in power in the context of the slaveocracies of the Americas, right? And so, some of that sort of gets to that. So those kinds of things, right? Let's see what else. And our main priest here that we talked about some here is Akomfo Noche. I'll talk about him a bit more, but he's a very important sort of figure in all of this. And he's sort of connected to this idea of freedom. So let me just talk again about, or just a bit more about how priests might have functioned in this role of spirituality, right? This is an excerpt from a 18th century account. Paul Hanserd, if you know who that person is, Danish. And you can see in the language, it's pejorative in some places, but he's hinting at something, right? Mistreated slaves sought refuge as servants to priests of powerful shrines in Aquapem. Former days, he says, the priests had a good revenue from runaway slaves protected with the fed. So it makes it appear as if the priests are just about that money, right? And no, priesthood and spirituality throughout the world has close affiliations to taking your money, right? A slave master satisfied with his master comes to the fetish house or temple and seats himself inside of a kind of altar. The priest who goes there daily to make sacrifices asks what he or she is seeking. I want to give my body to the fetish. The priest who now understands perfectly accepts. Now, think about someone who is escaping or running away from potential slavery, right? And going to a place or a shrine of a priest and being able to find protection there. We have history and tradition that sort of validate this sort of role by priests. And yes, at the same time, you have priests who will sell people away. So this is not to say that every priest has this idea of freedom and protecting their own people, right? And then that whole issue of own people, right? The Khan, the God, the Guam. Remember, there's some intersection. This is why we say discontinuous or They're sort of non-linear because sometimes they're close together and allied, but in other instances, other clans, other formations, that's not the case. Right? That's what we'll see. Right? So this just gives us an idea. I'll read another little portion from the book here. I'll start with that quote by Key again. Arguably, local culture was guided by unacknowledged conditions of action, and contemporary philosophical rituals possess historical validity. In this context, the framework for freedom as a viable construct emerged. Freedom was accessible as odahie, which is an Akan word which translates literally to free man or free person, and fahuode, which is another Akan word that again affiliates or connects to ideas of freedom. Hayele is God, and that means independence or liberty. Certainly for nobles and freemen or commoners and slaves, these ideas were knowable. Freedom in personhood and cognition was discernible in real instances of revolt against established political or spiritual authority, ideations of rebellion enacted in, for example, what are called these alpo ceremonies, where they sort of reverse things, where the king is seen as the slave and the slave is seen as the king, and they act out the political questions and problems of their various state or nation in that context. That's an annual celebration, right? Lampooning liberty, as it's called, right? Where communities sang satirical ballads of faults, villainies, and frauds of their superiors and their inferiors, right? That runaway shine sought out solace of sacred shrines, and priest supports assertions of freedom as a recognizable concept. Well-documented occurrences of slaves' attempts to indiga, no he kewan, to dash oneself to God, is identifiable in this case, God, but also Guan and Akan culture and freedom, and infer affinities of identity, spirituality, and freedom. In Afro-Atlantic, continually crisscrossed by movements of people, not only as commodities, but engaged in various struggles towards emancipation, autonomy, and citizenship, is particularly relevant in this context. American declarations and late 17th and 18th century colonial legislation hint at the importance of African-oriented cosmologies to maroon, slave, and free black resistances to slavery here in the Americas. Cosmology is connected to African identities via a quote-unquote magic past, as a flight back to Africa at their choosing, or operations in magic as a symbol of retribution and justice was an idea shared with others lamenting the fate of enslavement. This spirituality connected to Africanisms and creolization, but also pre-colonial attributes of a range of specific and modified West and West Central African histories and social practice. Freedom represented a local state of being and a social status reactive to capture and enslavement. And remnants of these Gold Coast ontologies were replicated in Atlantic thoroughfares. Freedom in West African and Atlantic worlds are mutually excusable but interconnected. Transatlantic contact did not engender local ideas of freedom, yet West African ideas were incongruous to the polities or political systems and cosmologies that ebb and flow with transfer of regional captives brought to America. So again, it's a variable thing. There's some variation there. But the importance for me is getting to the place where we start to think around the validity of this sort of concept, right? That people would actually leave Africa and have a perception of freedom. It seems like for us who are familiar with the black experience, some of us are, well, of course they did, no kidding, right? Of course they would remember what it meant to be free, right? But the challenge is that we don't see that manifested in the way we perceive freedom. We don't see it manifest. We haven't sort of wrestled out these ideas, right? An example would be, how many films about the Maroons are there? Or even about and when I get into some of the African stuff, these traditions are just, they're stories, they're heroine stories, they're stories, you're like, you just open your mouth, you want to, that was a good story. And people are always saying, well, we don't have good stories to tell. I'm tired of the rhetorical slave narrative. And I'm always like, okay, yeah, I agree. Here's a book. There are many others that begin to talk about some things that are very good starting points for better sort of cultural production of these kinds of things. Right? But, so let me talk about Confidential Son, right? So he's this priest who has these very special powers, right? He grows up in this village called Awakugwa, which is where actually I spent, a good amount of time. From being a child on up through adulthood. He was famous as a wanderer and a priest, right? And you can see some idea of when he actually is argued to have lived, right? But again, here you have the priest that, if you see the picture there, when the Ashanti nation is established in 1701, right? This is the priest who will call down the golden stool that will land at the foot of Osei Tutu, the first king of the Ashanti. This is the priest, right? And now it's interesting because you have all these narratives, and many people will say, well, no, Okomfo is a Khan. He's an Akan man. He grew up just outside of Kumasi, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He has this direct affiliation to Osei Tutu and the kings of the Ashanti and the Akan nation. But actually, he's Guan. And the Guan, or Chire folks in the eastern region, were the low people. They were the farmers. They didn't have much, but their spiritual vitality in the region was very strong, right? So this priest gets essentially handpicked out of the eastern region and brought to Kumasi through a series of incidences to call down this golden stool, which will be a very important element, piece of the sort of royal objects that will support this idea and validate an Ashanti state. So in that way, very, very important, right? But regardless of that, Okomfo is not into history, or as, in the technical language, we would say devoid of historical intentionality. We don't see him, right? Most folks talk about him as a metaphor, a series of philosophical meanings, right? He's only in the literature in a very mechanical sense. But I would challenge you, if you ever go to Ghana, and I would encourage you to go, as the first person you meet who Okomfo is. And you'll have your answer with that, right?
He's the nation builder.
He's a nation builder. And so his
golden stool is like the Constitution.
There you are.
That's the basis.
Thank you. Yes. Yes. Thank you. And it adds real legitimacy to the state. And if you know about the Ashanti, you know some of that piece, right? So let me just read one story. And this occurs prior to his arrival at Ashanti in 1701. So this is a bit early, right? And now we begin to talk about a folk called the Akwamu, right? I mentioned them just before, the Akwamu, Aurora Frown. Masters of firepower, as they are called, right? And these guys were some serious folks, right? Initially for the gold trade, the most strength they exert around military and political and economic action is to capture and control the gold trade. Most sort of historians and others always presume that it's that slave trade, but the slave trade comes later. That's a very important sort of element there, right? Let me say a few more things just about these folks before I read this short piece. Their king Ansa Sasraku, right, the first, right? His descendants take his name. They last on into, it's roughly lasts from 1680 to about 1733. They're deposed by the Achem, right? But they do some very innovative things, right? One of them is a new style of sort of fighting, right? And this is relevant because of the contact with the Europeans, right? Instead of running directly en masse in war, they began this flanker formation, so they would spread out. And this was also helped, of course, by now the use of not just projectiles that you throw, but projectiles that you load with gunpowder and fire, right? So this just added to their innovation. And my point in sharing this is that what this represented was the Nifa, the Benkum, and Agona, or flanker formation. And so where different groups are assigned under the authority of, say, the Ashanti or the Akwamu, echoed this flanker formation. So chieftaincy was applied in the context of this flanker. So you have groups that will be at the center. You have groups that will be at the left. You have groups that will be at the right? Or the center being the vanguard, right? And so these groups will be arrayed. But what this does is replicate a system of political culture throughout the region, right? And it's one of the pieces that adds to the idea of the connectivity of these folks, right? If you think about the Kente cloth, for instance, right? If you ever look at it, it's very interconnected. That idea is also manifested in the way in which the state apparatus is created, right? So these were serious fighters. They're some of the first to come in contact. And I'll talk some about the origins too here in a moment. But let me just give Okomfo little oral tradition, right? So the gong bell sounded echoed from Akugwa, across mountain farms, religious shrines, palaces, and markets, and nearby villages of the hill people. Kwabena Sidio, former chief priest of Okomfo, recalled sometime in the last half of the 17th century that Okomfo used the gong to summon the Adadifo, the governing elders of our Kugwa. And so you have 7 heads of the 7 major clans. It's called the Adadifo. right? And he calls them to deliver this very important message. In their presence, Okomfo Noche says, or he foretells that the Akwamu are coming to fight in 7 days. And Okomfo Noche says, don't worry. He assures the town elders that he will protect them through his magic, and that he would stop these folks who would be planning to come to invade and either first plunder the town and then the remnants potentially be sold away, right? So when the Akwamu arrive, what does Okomfo Noche do? He forms a tree with his arms to hide from the Akwamu. So the Akwamu come, they shoot at this sort of blockade of trees. All their bullets just hit the trees and they break. And at that moment, Okomfo Noche removes his arms and they chase the Akwamu to east of the Volta River where they reside today, right? So that's the tradition, right? But now we want to sort of paint it in some context just a little bit more. Let me just add some of this. Anoke's magic drew the adoration of Awakugwa residents and the disdain of the Adidafo elders and competing priests. They ultimately sold Anoche to the Ashanti. That's how he ends up in Kumasi, according to oral tradition. Right? Prior to this, Anoche maintained frequent residence at Awakugwa as a wanderer, and he visited all the major states at the time. The Achem, who were growing, the Dinkira, who at the time had control over the Ashanti. The Ashanti was just starting to come into fruition, but he goes and visits those folks as well. And also, of course, he visits the Akwamu. An Achem account says, Noche wandered to the town of Veracuso and assisted a certain person, Manu, the mother of Osei Tutu, to help and cure her infertility. So by the time Osei Tutu is born, it's argued that Okomfo Noche is about 20 years, so he's a senior. But they instantly become friends as he grows because this prince, Osei Tutu, is destined, according to tradition and belief, to be ultimately the king of the Ashanti, which he will be, right? So you got all these sort of traditions around him. And Anoche at one point predicted Osei's future, and then he said that the Akwamu are going to decline, right? And then in that moment, they tie him up and get ready to sell him away. So again, here we get to an instance where the issues of freedom, I think, can come into play because people try to ransom him first, but they don't have enough money. We know ransom played a real function in West Africa during the time of the slave trade. There were many instances throughout the history of West Africa. You can name a range of places where if someone got captured, if the person came with the right amount of money and paid it, that person got right out and went right back, right? And was not so infrequent, right? And so this idea then that you have this high priest captured by the Akwamu, held there for a long time, and the potential for him being sold. Imagine, he goes to the Americas, right? I mean, of course he doesn't, because who will come in to save him? Osei Tutu will pay his ransom. And then after that, he leaves and goes into, seclusion to only show up at the time where he calls the golden stool, right? Well, let me read this about this tradition. Okomfo Noche's protection of Akugwa was an act of spiritual resistance that protected his people, although evidence of Akugwa's opposition to Akwamu is lacking. Oral history suggests that the town was momentarily spared amidst the subjection of their neighbors, but envious and divisive local leaders undermined any chance to capitalize. And then you have a very interesting Dutch account. This is where the archives, I think, do the best sort of thing, right? Here go the Dutch in 1658 recording this account. An elder from Bonn, and then you have a place called Bonn, which is right in the eastern region, a predecessor to Awakugwa and these other states. So he's making a reference to this in 1658, and he says, an elder from Bonn comes down to the coast, right, and he is seized and sold by the Akwamu, right, in 1658. Now that's very suggestive now, because we do at this point begin to see a growing intimidation by the Akwamu. This is about the middle of the 17th century, and this is now when the slave trade starts to really pick up speed. Right? A couple of things have happened to sort of facilitate that, right? But chronologically, the legends of Okomfo Noche's protection of Awakugwa coincided with the Dutch displacement from regional trade and Danish acquisition of Christiansburg Castle in 1681. It also coincided with the sacking of Greater Accra. Remember, the Akwamu will come and take this from the Ga in 1680. The Ga will lose control because what they would do, I mean, if you know these castles, right? Cape Coast Castle, Fort Comaratine. I think I have a picture over here. We can look at it. Sorry. This is Fort Comaratine. So, I mean, there are many other, or it's also called Fort Amsterdam. there are many other forts. I mean, some of you, if you've been to West Africa, especially in this area, you know there are a lot of forts there. There's so many forts concentrated in the gold coast. Anybody, why were they there? Is it just for slaves?
No.
It was not. Gold. And in fact, Elmina, one of the other very famous castles, its name means gold, right? Mina is gold, right? And and that was going on. That's when the Portuguese arrived there in 1480. So there's a gold trade happening very early. And that will go about 2 centuries before we really see the export of people from this region into the Americas, right? That's a very important bit of evidence. I think that's very important for us to sort of consider, right? If we consider this legend as indicative of some form of idealized or real resistance, it plausibly occurred sometime around the time that the Bond Elder was seized, 1658, and the time that the Ga people lose control of Accra to the Akwamu, right? So something in there, if this really happens, right? Rivalry and war between the Ga and Akwamu for control of the Gold Coast Atlantic trade underscored the importance of humanizing silenced oral histories of resistance and reaction to enslavement during the latter 17th century. And that's what Akomfo-Noche's tradition is. This narrative idealized an instance of collective resistance to local domination and transatlantic enslavement. Effectively, this oral account downplayed regional tensions between the main towns. So there was tension. So he said, could this really have happened, right? Read exclusively, it suggested that the Guano, the Achire spiritual authority was above the Akwamu, was above the Ga, was above the other groups, powerful enough to intersect in this regard, right? Think about this tradition. Think about the idea of making the case of this spirit priest and this tradition of him doing his arms like this and saying that this establishes real historical precedent, right? Some of you who do history know that there will be real complications with it. There will be questions and problems that will come from it. Now, myth, sure, but myth is important. Let's not forget, right? But to argue it in the sense to say exclusively, well, based on a collection of oral accounts, based on some circumstantial evidence from the archives, ethnographic field research, I can argue that this priest protected this small town of Akuba, right? And so you say, you can leave it there, right? And the reason why I don't feel so obligated to sort of say, let me prove it to you, right? For one thing, I'm drawn to what folks like Gates reminds me, right? What does Gates say, right? They chose not to forget music, myth, expressive institutional structures, and metaphysical systems of order, right? Or another person you may have heard of, Robert Ferris Thomas, who said song and dances actually were manifestations of social illusion, suspended pattern. These constructs convey dramatic African influence in visual art, dance, and music. So there's something to the myth. So for me, it's not so important to say, okay, here I can prove it. And then the other piece, I think that's equally significant, is that the other histories, and I won't talk about them so much now, but that are show up in the book, the God histories of these events. The way the God talk about this is harrowing, right? At one point, the king, they captured him. He's been such an evil king, right? He kicked out the Dutch because they didn't play right. That part I'm all right with. But then he invites the Danish in, and then he starts trading gold with them. And the Akwamu watched all this sort of take place and just said, we're just going to wait. We got a bigger army. We've been buying up guns, this kind of a thing. And so at one point, they catch this guy king they convince the members of his army to shoot their guns, but to have sans bullets, no bullets, right? And the Akwamu soldiers, the Awura Fram, remember, the masters of firepower, they're not using round balls. They start in the end of the 17th century to use outlong, right? I mean, it almost looks like the projectiles that we know of as a bullet today, right? And what do they say? The ball goes in, but these oblong projectiles, they tear something from the body as they go through, right? And so he began to talk about the importance of this, but at any rate, they trick all of the Ga soldiers and they wanted to depose their king, so they agreed, to shoot without bullets. So when they shoot, their guns don't have any bullets. They're overran by the Akwamu. They burn Accra to the ground. They dig up, take out gold. They do all these things. They take over Cape Coast Castle and the other castles that are not Cape Coast, Fort James, which is right there, Christianburg and others, which are right there. They took over those forts. And then the king, when he's cornered, he's with his son, and his son says to him essentially, Dad, why did you make it so that everyone hated us, and we couldn't find anyone to help us. And his dad is sort of despondent. He paints his front black and he paints his back white and sits on top of all this gunpowder and just, ends his life. That's one account of how it happens, right? After he's lost his kingdom. And the Ga folks travel east, right? Because some of their origins are connected with the people like Benin. They have very strong Yoruba affiliation. Some of those other groups far east, they went and they headed right east, right? Tried to reestablish themselves. But anyway, you can see, the guns playing. But you got all these different traditions. The Ga tell their story. The Akwamu version of this account. And you can compare those with what the Kofanoche Guan tradition is telling us, right? And then if you start doing those together, now the oral tradition, which may not have a lot of historical value, takes on very quickly a lot of importance. If you want to discount it, if you start dealing with it in the context of the history that it's describing, it becomes very, very interesting in that regard. So those kinds of things, right? And let me just say something about this gold trade. I know I mentioned that some too. Let me just go back to that very briefly. Say a few things here, right? And again, the Akwamu are called. They have a number of different names. One, though, that is important one is Twifo, is their sort of organizing state just above the Cape Coast in Ghana, right? But they trace their origins to Dayula and the descendants of the Mali Empire who settled at Kong in modern-day Ivory Coast. So, it's very interesting because now you talk about a people who say, we were trading gold in the Trans-Saharan network to the Mediterranean, right? And now, look at us now. We turn and we're right there and we come up and we meet up right with the Europeans and start trading with them. For me, that's astounding, right? And then the piece that I think really adds power to it is that you have this very famous archaeologist. I mean, if you know about some of the archaeology of the region, Thurston Shaw, Paul Ozane, James Anquanda, these folks are very important. They've been doing a lot of work. And one of them, Ozane, finds an oil lamp from Mauritania. That's like the 10th or 11th century, right? And he just finds it there. And Mauritania is part of the Sudanic network. Would have been part of Mali, and Ghana maybe prior, and Songhai after, right? So, wow, that he would find that below the Cape Coast in the new Twifo lands before they moved east to start to conquer Accra and those places is very suggestive. Now we get to sort of Diop's idea of cultural unity. And that's just one example. If you really want to have a cultural unity dialogue, pre-colonial, some of you know, there are clear markers for that kind of thing. But here we see something in the archaeological record that shows that, right? Let me also add, so the Akwamu's goal was to obtain direct access to the coast and achieving control of the trade paths, right? This guaranteed a flow of money to the tolls into the Akwamu state treasury, facilitating extensive military operations funded by gold pounds or payments offered to the European merchants against guns and gunpowder. And then you add that with this new innovation that they sort of come up with in terms of the approach to the fight, right? But the regional gold supply located in interior lands and the European demand for it since the late 15th century centered at the Gold Coast. I would argue that the Atlantic plantations do not come online if the Europeans do not access this gold. This region. It will not go because it finances it. The gold finances, and this is, if anybody know this mint or currency, the beginning, right?
Isn't it, okay, well, Euro, I got it. Is that Victorian?
Yeah, one of the Queen's, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Because it looked like Victorian, but it could be Dutch, but I'm not really
It isn't
sure.
Dutch. It might have Latin on there. I'm not sure what that language is, but it's a minted piece there again. And so and it became the standard weight of gold. You see. Let me read on though. 17th century gold trade contingent on local ideas of ownership, land tenure, transaction, communalism, and individuality. So yes, regionally they were mining gold and they were selling it. They had the history of the Trans-Saharan network of being able to already do that. So then the idea of mining and selling gold was very much, made good sense. It was something that they could definitely make wealth and resources from, right? But they saw it differently. The Europeans perceived they could come in and just dig it out wherever they wanted. And the local folks didn't agree with that. Again, The soil was a deity or a goddess, and it could not be neither bought or sold. It was protected under ownership of ancestors, past, present, and future. Yes, and the kings and the royals commodified that, of course, right? But just conservative estimates alone confirmed that between 150,000 and 200,000 pounds of gold were exported between the 15th and 17th centuries by various European powers, right? And that's important. And that predates when the numbers of people start to come in very, very large numbers, right? It's not always appreciated how late was the date when slaves became the most important export. And I'm talking about this region. Yeah, if you want to look south, West Central Africa, and talk about Rwanda, and talk about the Congo and these things, yeah, it's a different conversation. And if you want to go up further east, up into the upper West Africa, and talk about some of those states and their affiliation with the slave trade, it's a different dialogue. Right? But certainly nobody's coming out of the Gold Coast until 1641. And that's the first documented account of people coming out of there. 299 people to Barbados. That's the first documented trip. And you say, well, again, I mean, you read the European accounts with a bit of skepticism, and you should. Right? But why would this be so accurate? Right? Because each one of these persons that was made captive represented what? Money. Wealth. So then that suggests something about the accuracy and importance of those records, right? Yeah, they snuck stuff over. We know that the Portuguese and the Spanish were, they're at Elmina, so they're already trying to move people around. So that's something that you could certainly talk around. But it's just important to note that even if you take that as saying, well, there's slave trading going on, the numbers coming out of the region are very low, right? And I use something that if you are familiar with it, the slave trade database. Slave Voyages database, slavevoyages.org. You can look in, you can put in some compilations and do research, and it comes out and spits out numbers, and you can sort of use those data sets to draw conclusions. I don't like to use the data exclusively, because then you get into the point of just making these people who are captive little dots. And I think that's illogical, because that commodifies them even further. If our goal is to dismantle these folks out of the context of just being a commodity, then we want to sort of humanize them a little bit better. And for me, that means, hey, okay, we got the data evidence. What do the traditions also tell us? What do the ethnographic and other accounts sort of offer us? What does the archaeological evidence suggest? Right? Those kinds of things, right? So this becomes very important. And there's a few other themes here on the African side that I could talk more about before we actually even get into the Americas. But I just want to touch on one more, and then we can sort of look at one example in Jamaica, and then we'll sort of just pause there, because we could begin to talk about 1712 in New York, and we can maybe that'll be part of our conversation. So I don't take up too much time and afford some time for some discussion. So the Aquamu. The Aquamu, right? So they rule once they get power. In 1680, by that time now you're talking about a slave trade that's picking up steam, right? If I just show you this and you look at folks that are now coming from the Gold Coast, and those numbers are suggestive, right? You can see they're from 1661 to 1665, that's about 900 folks, and that's one of the earliest accounts. The 1641 stuff is 300, 400 people a year. It's not big, right? That's 1661. And then you can see something happens there between 1676 and 1700, and all of a sudden, the number of folks coming out of the Gold Coast is tenfold, right? And it's going to jump again, right? And what has happened there? And then you see it, now they stay high, right? What has happened there? What is sort of the causality? What's going on? Well, this is the Aqua movement, right? And what has happened is essentially that they realized that the Europeans have realized that there's a new player in the game in the control of the gold, and that's the Aqua movement. They have cornered the gold market. They're not going to allow. It gets so bad that the Portuguese start showing up with ships from Brazil with precious metals to buy captives in Africa because they can't get access to gold in West Africa, in the Gold Coast, right? So something like that's very, very telling in terms of, we're running out. And the Akamu are now cornering this market. But the Europeans want one thing, and they'll trade guns for that one thing, right? People, right? And so the gun trade just blows up, right? Let me just read this. The English characterized firearms as a mighty drug, selling as much as 20,000 tons of gunpowder and large quantities of carbines and blunderbusses in the Gold Coast. Dutch merchants claimed to sell only to their allies at Elmina, but in practice granted them as gifts and never controlled an interloper trade in guns. You know, the big companies would come up and show up and be at the castle and say, we got the gold, come see, or we got the guns, come see us, we'll sell them to you. But then you have people from those same regions who come separately as an interloper trader and say, shoot, I got guns too. I got guns on my little ship right here. I'm gonna give you a better rate than they're gonna give you at the castle. You're gonna buy it from me, right? And if the Dutch found out that one of their someone from their nation was doing this, you know, that resulted in death, right? But at any rate, the Herman Ebrans, the chief of the Dutch personnel at Cape Coast, for instance, observed, since rifles and gunpowder have been introduced, things have become much worse. Consequently, the whole Gold Coast has come into a kind of state of war, right? So, wow, you really begin to see the impact of this sort of new innovative system the Akwamu are executing, but now no longer for gold, because now the most valuable thing is the people, right? And what has happened is that the gold from here has financed the stabilization of the American plantation economies, right? I mean, look at all of the people who are, every person who comes to the Americas and establishes a colony has a foothold in this region. The Dutch, the Danes, you know, you got a few Danish Caribbean islands, right? Which there's some amazing rebellions on those, and I talk about those in my book as well. The English, obviously, right? The Portuguese, right? The Germans, but there is no German state at that point, right? Those folks who will become the Brandenburgers are there. So everyone who's establishing themselves, the Danes, oh, I said the Danes, I mean, are there. So this kind of a thing, right? So that tells you something about how valuable what's going on at the Gold Coast, right? The value and the importance of that began to take shape, right? And so the tension between the Akwamus going into different groups, like the Achim, for instance, they would just take citizens and take them and sell them away, which was considered illegal. And in fact, the Akwamu had, the kings created their own bureaucracy of men who were like their loan sharks, essentially, the Sikaden. And what they would do was call them in grapples. If you didn't pay what you owed, or if they perceived you as someone that they wanted to get rid of, they would sell you away, right? And that happened quite frequently. But the tension that began to create was quite significant. And that in itself very much suggests that people didn't like the idea of enslavement. And enslavement on the African side, there was real tension around this. And again, folks who study this, we know this, right? But it is not clearly manifested in the way we remember this history. We remember these people as the ones who are, everybody, when they talk about Africa, one of the first things they say is, well, they had slaves. They already had slaves going on there when they were there. And they were already enslaving each other, so then that made it okay for us to come and take those people away from here, right? It's always been a big element of the justification. We were saving their souls. We were going to Christianize them, right? But in actuality, that was sort of used as a foil to justify, you know, kind of what was going on, right? But things start to hit the fan, and the Achim are going to start fighting back. So I just want to read some of that, because out of the very name Achim come these ideas of freedom, and that's something I just want to stress, and then we'll go right to the example, right? History and tradition recount events whereby Achim established the Abuakwa stool at Akuapem. Sometime after their defeat by the Akwamuhini and Sakwa, that's the Akwamu in 1729, the mountain groups referred to as Akuapem swore an oath of allegiance, and then they said and invited the Achim to come and help them, right? And at the coast, the God, the Adang, the Akan, and other groups, they were sick of the Akwamu as well. This is around 1730. And so they agreed with this plot to displace this very violent order that had taken control of the eastern Gold Coast, right? And so they make an agreement, a collective agreement of folks agree that they're going to now fight, and they establish themselves. And where do they make this agreement that they're going to fight for liberty from the Akwamu? At a shrine, a very famous shrine, the Abataki shrine. Concord at Abataki is what this is called in 1730. They make it 1731, then the battle ends in 1732. So this is a very important moment And you see all these folks get together to agree around, hey, you know what? We want our own freedom. We want our own, we don't want to be controlled by the Aquamu, right? And we're going to fight to do this, right? And then the name itself. Aquapim means it's been either 1,000 subjects, right? Aquapim, or 1,000 companies, right? That's what it translates into literally. Like 1,000 servants or 1,000 folks as a company, as a group of 1,000 men organized to fight or to what have you, right? But this name exhibits a coalescence of freedom, identity, and spirituality in a number of researchers, right? It's works, right? As subjects, Aquapim memorialized the political formation of their overlordship with the Achim, whereby they renegotiated tenure rights and secured protection from a stool against capture, at least in theory, right? And as companies, Aquapim memorialized they were neither dokonor or a sacrificial slave. They were free enough to control their own path in acquiescence to an Achim stool. So they chose a new ally when the Aquapim, or when the Aquamu was cleared, were largely engaged in the sort of violence within the region, right? Aquapim itself represented a counter-narrative to Atlantic and American affiliations of African culture and history with enslavement, barbarism, and brutality. In 1728, the Hill groups justified their alliance as a resolve, since it is their will to serve it is not their will to serve the Aquamu kings as their conquerors, but they would not be treated as purchased slaves, right? So see, that tells me something about what's going on in sort of the thinking. This assertion correlated to database archival and oral evidence that Achim actually reduced the volume of human traffic at a time when it plausibly rivaled gold as the most important and profitable commodity on the Gold Coast, right? So in the midst of this, we have the Achim do something that again speaks to the idea of freedom. In establishing the paramount stool of Aquapim in 1733, they kept slaves in their own country, permitted them to marry, and treated them so well that the Aquamus who they captured quickly forgot their own country and king and became, in the course of 5 years, equal to native-born Achims. That's, again, highly significant. It's quite suggestive of something. And if you look at the database record, and I don't believe I put that slide in here, but what you start to see is the number dip. Right after 1733 up to about 1740 or so, the numbers coming out of there sort of go down. And then right at 1750, they go back up. But that's because the Fanti. That's the Fanti, that's not the Eastern Gold, right? I have another, if this is online, I can actually pull that data set up if folks want to see. But the numbers, they drop dramatically. And it's very clear that a change is afoot. And what the change is that the Akayim are no longer the Aquamu. And they've decided not to emphasize the slave trade. And once again, they hold the gold, right? And what it forces people to do is then they say, well, we got to go to Cape Coast. We got to go to Comarat-10. And those are the Fanti. And the Fanti continue to trade. And then also, too, the Ashanti begin to emerge. And then when the Ashanti defeated Inchira, they sent many of those folks to the coast to be sold away. Right? But check the eastern region during this time. The trade has all but dried up. And as evidence of that, again, I'll refer to an archival account, just because of the clarity that it provides, right? Refer to one quick archival account here. How y'all doing? Nobody's going to sleep on me yet, are they? Of course not. I know it's a lot of words. Here we go. And this is the director of the West India Guinea Company in Copenhagen in 1730. This is what he writes. We understand from asking daily about how the Achim, about how with the Achim trade, that, in other words, how can they trade, right? That we very rarely, almost never sell slaves, but in trading exclusively use gold. The little we have had from them can be considered good gold. So that a slave trade, according to what the blacks say, will as good as cease here at Accra. And that's the 28th of December, 1730. I'm the director of Copenhagen, right? Of the Guinea. And this is one of the companies that, of course, is moving large numbers of folks across the coast, right? So there's something at work here that I think is very, very significant. And folks will draw on this, right? When it comes to ideations of freedom. And that's sort of the natural transition into looking at what will happen in Jamaica. And I'm just using Jamaica as an example. If you read the text, you see I deal with some of the things that are happening in Barbados. I also look at the two Danish islands and their sort of major rebellions that take place there. You have some interesting stuff. Some of the Aquamu go straight to the Danish islands, right, first. and ended up there for some time. And then they about burned the place to the ground. It's a pretty interesting story there, but that's also mentioned in the book there. But if you look at those numbers of captives, right, and this is between 1660 and 1808, sort of the heyday of the Maroonids, right? And you can see that there are two pretty high numbers. That Vita Bianca gets up towards the end, but it only starts to jump towards the end. But really from about 1680 or so on, the folks coming from the Gold Coast, you can see are coming in pretty high numbers. Even with the 1730s, because of course the folks continue in the trade. But you end up with a good large number of folks there that are coming from that region. And why is that important, right? But what if folks are speaking the same language already? Are people coming here speaking Tree already and remembering Tree, right? Anybody know of the Akan day names, right? Kwame, Kofi, Abina, right? If you have those names, right? Where do those names come from, right? They're from the Tree. They go back to the early tradition. They're millennia old, some of those names for day names when you're born. When I spent time there, I got a day name. I was born on Friday. I'm a Friday-born child, so my name is Kofi, right? And then, you calculate back to the day you were born, and you can figure it out, and then you get a name. You get a name. But you find the same names in Jamaica during this time. The Kwames, the Kojo. Kojo's Maroons are tearing it up, as we will talk about here some. And then Granny Nanny, who is just, what she does is the most important for me because it's very, very powerful stuff. And this is just some example of some of the things that are going on in the American system, right? And are there Maroons in the mainland United States?
Yes.
Yes. Right? 50 plus Maroon communities between the 17th and 19th century in the North and South Carolinas, in Virginia, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama. So it's just not a Caribbean phenomenon or Latin American phenomenon, right? But again, you have the scant evidence and the scant sort of emphasis on that. And I always said, we always talk about sort of field slave interconnectedness. The field slave did this, the house slave did this kind of thing. And I always said, where's the Maroon fit in there, right? Because of the importance of what it is that they do, right? They were proactive in fighting and finding ways to survive and savvy in their interaction with the native groups. Right away, they meet with the native groups. The native groups showed them the way, and that's how they learned how to survive. And they also developed these guerrilla tactics, which are just, again, when people always are saying, I can't make a film about slavery anymore. Yeah, stop making them then. Stop making those films, because look at what these folks do, right? Those are trees. Can you see those trees? I know it's Christmas time, right? You see the tree there, right? These are trees, man, leaves, right? They're covered, right? And how did they use this to effect in the Maroon, in Jamaica, right? Well, how many folks have been to Jamaica before, right? Spent some time in Jamaica, right? If you're ever up there in the Blue Mountains, right? You see some places where if you look down, it's like a 500-foot drop, 600-foot drop. That's called cockpit country, right? That's Kojo. And then where Nanny's Maroons are is in the Windward. And that's Blue Mountains, I'm sorry. That's Blue Mountains. And then Kojo is cockpit country, Leeward Maroons, right? But in the Blue Mountains, there are all these places where they can run around, move around, escape. And there are places where you climb up a great climb, right? And you get to the top, and once you get there, there's maybe 7,500 acres of perfect green land, water sources there. The only way to get to that place, right, is to climb up a mountain, right? Now, if you got 10 men, you can stop an army of 500 that are trying to climb. Because you can't, that's the only way to get up, right? And so the Maroons use that to great effect, right? And then look at, again, you get to the archival accounts here, that you got to be skeptical. Here's one. And they use the names all wrong. They mispronounce the names and everything. This is ever long if you know history of Jamaica, right? As a very important tradition, right? He says, Akims, Fatins, Ashantis, the A-S-H. And most folks, if you tell them the A-S-H, they understand what they say, no, A-S-A-N-T-E, right? Ashantis, Kwambos, that's Akwamu. Inclusive in their definition of the label Komorites, as more than a desperate group of tribes. They played very important, those same groups played important roles, right? We just talked about their roles and their functionality in West Africa. So now see them as captives, coming in large numbers, not always dispersed separately, and organizing and planning and reacting with putting sheer terror in the British colonists, right? Sheer terror. I mean, I'm waiting for the movie to be made. All right, I'm going to stop saying that. But I'm waiting. I'm going to make it myself, actually. But just listen to this account. And this is archive stuff. But it's also from some of the oral accounts and others. There's Bev Hart, who collected a range of traditions. There's Ken Bilby, who did all these oral accounts. There's Werner Zipp. There are others. I mean, you can see that a lot of the Europeans drew right into some of this work.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Since you're discussing the Maroons, I didn't know that they had areas in North America where there were Maroons. I'm thinking that it was in Jamaica and other places where the slaves got together and they were there as a community, and they held off the captors and what have you.
Yeah.
Now, if they had them in the States, could you give me information on where, what areas of Alabama and what have you, where I could find that information?
We could talk after class. There's a person who I presented at a conference with in Cuba who wrote, she refused to do it as history because of the very problems that we're discussing, because she thought that the myth of this was just as important, and she emphasized American. Give it a minute, I'll come up with her name, and I can share that text with you, because she wrote at Lincoln. And she sort of said, you know, because she was like, well, why wouldn't we replay the history of maroonage and resistance in the American situation? Why would we not? Why would we try to downplay that, right? And some of those answers, you know, you can sort of see what would that mean? Because even for these folks, I mean, the Maroons, these folks end up, when they finally whooped the British so many times that the British sued for peace in 1741, the British sneak in something that says, we'll pay you to capture runaways. And so folks start to bring runaways back, and they begin to accrue revenue from that. But even that, people will say, well, look, you can't call Maroons freedom fighters, they're capturing slaves. But think about the fact that the very slaves were trying to capture them, right? They were fighting in a sort of separate sort of space to sort of maintain their legitimacy, right? And I mean, we have to view them as, in part, doing some very negative things to slaves, right? And recapturing them. And it's vice versa. The oral traditions and other accounts talk about slaves treating them very poorly as well. The Second Maroon Rebellion, in fact, in 1795-96, starts because a slave beats a Maroon for what he claims to be the stealing of a wild boar. So, you know, you have that real tension there. And I guess maybe where I was sort of going there, just, you know, they would really symbolize freedom. Even with all those problems around that, the notion of freedom that they represented because they had broken away from society and formed their own was significant. In instances when it happens here in the Americas, there's a real tension around that. You know, there's a couple of thoughts come to mind. We can talk more about this. Let me get through the rest of this here. And then I just want to read this last little account, and then we could just open it up for discussion there. This is Nanny's Maroons, right? Ooh, there you go. Last little bit here. And thank you for your patience with me. I know it's a little long. Hopefully not too long. Sorry about that. Captain Stoddard and 800 soldiers were led up by a spy to Nannytown on a mountaintop. The soldiers wouldn't push their tent or settle down in those huts. At midnight, they finally decide to settle down. And at midnight, the Maroons throw torches on the huts. Maroons burn down but for a house them. This is right from the tradition. When them used to fight, them split the wood and called the wood kanja stick. And it's a type of flammable wood, also pronounced as candia. So my guess is they might have dipped it in something flammable. That's an interesting way to describe it. And they sit down in the daytime and they cut the man out and they sharpen it. They split them into lengths of about a yard or so, and then lit them. So when the soldiers were sleeping, thinking that all was well, they threw them on the thatch and burned down the entire place. You can imagine the type of fear that pervaded the atmosphere of those soldiers who at first thought they had conquered. And that's just one instance. So you got to just imagine this sort of moment of the British colonial soldiers, and they're also oftentimes forcing local settlers who aren't fighters to go up in these mountains and chase these people down as well. Right? So they got all their army equipment, they bring up their howitzer cannon. They try to bring this up, 100, 200 foot piece, right? To get up there where they can fire it off at. So they get to where they believe Nannytown to be, and they settle there. Okay, we got it. We got the village, we got it. But the Maroons have actually went up a bit higher, and they've watched the entire thing in the dark. So once they settle down and get ready to go to sleep for the night, here go the Maroons firing what are nothing less than flaming projectiles. And they burn these guys out pretty quickly, right? And again, the archives is interesting because 1734 siege of Nannytown documented skilled use of flaming projectiles and a long-distance surprise attack that contributed to the enemy's confusion. And how do we maybe know that this really had validity? An act was passed a year earlier to prevent the making, throwing of, firing of squids, serpents, rockets, or other fireworks. So in other words, something, we don't want that. But the British do not, you look in the archives, they're not going to say, they tell us something with them flaming projectiles. They'll just make the law. And you see in the litigation that they're really trying to stop this because of the potential that will have, right? But you got some of these great, accounts. I won't read all of them, but let me just read one. Again, I said that they were making and what's the word for compelling people into military service.
Drafting.
Well, drafting, yes. But like me say, conscription, right? When you conscript these folks. So imagine this guy, Ebenezer Lamb. He's an Irish indentured servant. He comes here. He's going to be a small landowner. He's not trying to go climb up in no damn mountains to chase the Maroons out. So, but they make him to do it because he will pay off his indentured servitude by doing this. So he will end his 7-year service and gain his freedom by going and leading this account. So he does it. So Ebenezer Lamb distinguished himself enough to gain his freedom as a scout on behalf of the colony. In September 1732, he led an attack and captured one of their towns on a steeply rocky hill approached through a ravine. Between 1732 and 1733, control of the rebel towns frequently changed hands between the Maroons, the militia, foot soldiers, and sailors. The Maroons dispersed into small parties, but gained the upper hand and took back the town and two strategically important plantations. And they would just control the plantations and go and get food and other supplies that they needed, that they wanted. Right? And Governor Hunter's report suggests the party became masters of the towns, or rather the ground. The niggers have Negroes, and he says, that's what he said, right? Have set fire to all the houses. The House of Assembly rewarded one slave soldier, Cuffy, with 5 pounds sterling and a hat and a red coat because he claimed to kill Nanny, right? So here now, and we're going to find out that this guy's actually telling a lie. This unverified assassination propagated success over the Obi woman and the Maroons amid recruiting challenges and fear of army slaves and free blacks. Years later, when the Maroons finally agreed to a treaty, the personhood of Nanny, a great Negro woman, was specified in the grant of 500 acres of land to build what is today Moortown. In June 1733, Maroon fighters surrounded the towns and fired from ambushes from 8 until 3, so thick that if they had stayed any longer, they must have been cut off. It was reported that the soldiers and sailors could only maintain the Negroes' towns as long as they had ammunition. It was also alleged that the Maroon numbers were increasing due to the opinion that the Leeward gang had joined them. So called those folks come help them out. So this is getting very, very serious, and it's going to destroy the Jamaican plantocracy if they do not make treaty with the Moors, right? So that tells you what's really at work. So they would call out to the slave porters and slave shot who were supposed to be chasing them and say things like, join them with the artful expressions to quit the slavish life. But the British militia becomes so nervous. Lieutenant Ashford found it mysterious that so much powder, so much ammunition, 16 cartridges per man, could not keep the town. Despite their military engagements, they had not brought in, as proof of killing a single ear of a rebel, right? And so Lamb and 3 other officers agreed to divide their attack on the women rooms. Let me jump forward to this, just this little piece of it. So, and you know, they start torturing people to find out what's going on with these Maroons. And one of the people they torture says that that there's a big fight and they're getting ready to plan to do this, right? And so they begin to move forward. I'm kind of paraphrasing here. But Nanny's supposed killing also downplayed events in September 1733, whereby rebel ambush surprised and killed a scout and a pilot, and in the confusion, another pilot, Henry Hanserd, and this was our Irish friends group, believing he was surrounded and cut off, and the officers killed, ordered retreat. The baggage porters were instructed to lay down their bags and fly, and to prevent our rallying, independent companies of soldiers and sailors plundered and destroyed their own equipment and supplies. These mutineers destroyed the ammunition boxes and threw away the powder in the ball, drank what liquor they could. The wicked and unlucky Hanserd and the other Irishmen were jailed and shot by order of court-martial for their role in this debacle. So essentially what they do is they destroy their own ammunition so they don't have to continue to fight. And they drink up all the liquor and everything so they don't have to continue to fight, so they can escape the potential of having to face these folks in battle, right? And you get these, you know, other kinds of harrowing accounts. You know, this kind of thing here. Forces met with extended periods of heavy rain, pitch black, and complete silence for fear of Maroon discovery. These were contrasted by intense fire battles, volleys of gunfire, and muzzle-to-muzzle fighting, right? So, I mean, you have this space. Think of this environment, the Blue Mountains. It's pitch black, right? And you're sneaking up in heavy rain as a British soldier trying to find out where this Nanny Town encampment is, right? And then there's moments where it's just pitch black. I mean, the quiet had to be itself deafening, right? And all of a sudden, Maroons come out, and they would come out of the ambuscade, as you saw with the trees, right? And come out and cut someone. And then another one comes from another side and does the same. And they used the cane bill, right? If you know the cane bill to cut sugar cane, it's a big square. I mean, so, and they come out, one, hit you, and step back. And then some of the accounts, the British say, the trees were attacking us. And I was like, yeah, they were, man. And so, but this is the sort of, imagine what that would do to an organized army that wasn't used to that sort of guerrilla warfare. That it breaks down instantly, and then very quickly, they're in a state of commotion, and then the Maroons can just take advantage. Right? Similar instances in 1712 in New York and in 1741 New York. We can talk about those if you'd like. But I'll stop right there and just sort of open it up for some discussion.
What about New York?
Yes, okay.
Now, you saying in New York, these are going to be people from the Gold Coast?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So you give us evidence of words
Yes.
from the archives?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And here you hear, I mean, in one of the accounts, the name is Kofi. Is the first name they named. Kofi and a Negro slave, 27 of them got together, set fire to the outhouse of the masters. Amid the commotion and noise and fires that spread through the town, the colonists began to flock to it. And when they did, the slaves fired and killed the colonists and wounded 5 or 6 more. The governor ordered a detachment under a proper officer, but the slaves retreated into the woods. Militias from New York and Westchester, by means and strict searches, found all that had put the design in execution. 6 having laid violent hands on themselves, so they committed suicide. The rest brought to trial before justices of this place. The governor reported to his superiors the exemplary punishment, inflicted on the assailants. The proceedings that followed led to the execution of 21 of 27 and 1 pregnant conspirator. Her execution temporarily suspended until the child was born. And that last piece, I was like, okay, that's something. Because everybody's been talking about this, but everyone just sort of misses this, what has just happened there. That the execution of the pregnant conspirator was delayed. Now, why would they do that? Right?
Silver body. I mean, the baby.
It's obvious, right?
Yeah.
But now, does this give us a good image of what is going on in terms of African womanhood and even Afro-Atlantic womanhood and even an emerging, very early African-American idea of womanhood that's beginning to take shape? Does this tell us anything about that? All it tells us is that these are people who are being subjected and treated with violence. We don't get any grasp of who they are, right? And once again, here we are where we are back to the movie, right? Because everyone says, oh, we can't tell the story right. Right? Who's heard of Donna Kemper-Vita? Anybody? From the Congo region, right? Her story is amazing. She's one who, you know, is supposedly to have heard from St. Anthony, and she engages in this effort to sort of try to save the Congo. And this is at the time where the Portuguese, the Dutch, the folks from the church, the papacy, have all become engaged here for their own intentions and purposes, right? And because she says St. Anthony has told her that she's got to come and sort of fix this world, they don't believe her. They call her a heretic. They burn her at the stake, right? It's an amazing story, and I'm just touching on the bits of it. But some folks from that region come to the Americas. And in fact, there's evidence of folks from during that very time period ending up in New York in that time. So, right? There's another very famous person. She's from, you know, this is from an archival account. Thomas Phillips writes about two women, right? One is, they call her John Brown, not the John Brown from the 1850 Civil War. John Brown from, she takes the name John Brown in 1683. She pretends to be a man on a ship that's on its way to the Cape Coast. And at the very end, the only reason they find out that it's a woman is because she gets sick. And they begin to undo her clothing. They're like, oh, okay, this is a woman. But they call her, if I can quote what Thomas Phillips says exactly, he says, a comely black woman of 20 or so years old. So she had actually did all the work that the men were doing on the ship, completely hid her identity, right? And then was on her way back and forth to Cape Coast Castle. So, wow. Now that, I mean, just the ideas of that. Yeah, she might have been participating in slavery. We don't know, right? There's a range of things, but just putting her in the space of a pregnant conspirator doesn't tell us who that is, right? We don't get enough about who that person is. And then the other one is a very powerful queen of Winneba, or Agona, one of the states there right at the coast. If we went back to our map there, right? And she's a powerful queen. She commands the space. In fact, so much so that Thomas Phillips comes to her very nicely and says, is it okay if we clean our boats and all this kind of thing? And she lets him do it, right? But what you see is a real example of a queen as a power. She's not, and I don't mean queen in the sense that she's part of a royal retinue. I mean queen in that she runs this space. So again, this label, pregnant conspirator, doesn't get us there. Right? The Ahosi women of the Fan, right? We call them the Amazon, right? They're warrior women. Does pregnant conspirator, I mean, it doesn't say who or what is really going on. So, I mean, that was something I sort of drew into, right? Women were not passive tropes as royals, spiritualists, or slaves in West and Central Africa, or captive labor in early America. Right? African women engaged in more subtle forms of resistance to American slavery. Women, despite the persistence of sexual violence, could be ungendered in oppressive labor regimes where poor diet, sickness, and fatigue limited fertility. For these captives, men and women alike, opposites of resistance were limited to submission, flight, or revolt. Yet potential afforded some women power to navigate terms of forced production. So that's some of what I began to talk about. And that's 1712, right? And if I just say very quickly about 1741, it's a different story, but once again, one of the main players in there is a Cuffy. And actually, this becomes a conspiracy in 1741. We can't exactly prove that this occurred, but apparently some slaves set fire to a very important fort there. Let me see that fort. Fort George on St. Patrick's Day, 1741. And many people said, what's going on here? And then there are other fires that start to show up. And at one point, some stuff is burning, and they catch Cuffy reportedly dancing. He huzzah, I don't know what huzzah is at 1741, danced, whistled, and sung. And then one person and this is like the fire brigade, they're putting out the fire, and every time the bucket comes to him, he pours it at his feet, because they report that there was so much mud there. So he wasn't helping to put the fire out. They give him the bucket, he'd be like, oh, okay, here you go. Here you go. He kept doing that. And at one point, he's there dancing, and someone gets mad at him, and he says, is this a time for a dance, right? So there was this idea. I mean, and he could have just been glad the thing was burning. It doesn't mean he was necessarily involved in some sort of conspiracy. But what it showed is that Horse Maiden, who was at the time the justice in New York, could really go to great lengths to accuse these folks of these crimes. And then the end result is that a number of people get killed due to this. But all of it, and all of the ideas around a potential conspiracy,
echo cosmological identity and spirit ideas coming from the locals.
I had a question.